Listen to me very carefully, because I am only going to say this once. And what I'm about to tell you could be the difference between you building generational wealth over the next decade or watching your purchasing power get quietly destroyed while you sit there thinking everything is fine. The United States government, your government, is now investing your tax dollars directly into the stock market, not metaphorically, not theoretically, literally. And here is the part that should make every single alarm bell in your brain go off at full volume. Japan did this same thing. Japan went down this exact road, and what happened to Japan? Japan lost 35 years of economic growth. 35 years. An entire generation of Japanese citizens worked harder than almost anyone on the planet and ended up poorer for it. Their wages fell. Their GDP per capita fell. Their stock market peaked in 1989 and did not break new record highs until the year 2024. I am not here to scare you for entertainment. I am here because the numbers are real. The historical precedent is real. And if you do not understand what is happening right now in 2026, you will pay for that ignorance with your financial future. So wake up, pay attention, and do not look away from what I am about to show you. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, and I mean right now, not at the end of this video, not maybe later, right now. Because the level of financial intelligence I am delivering on this channel is the same quality of analysis that hedge fund managers and institutional investors pay tens of thousands of dollars a year to access. You are getting it for free. But free only works if you show up consistently, and subscribing is how you make sure you never miss another briefing. This is a decision worth thousands of dollars. Make it. Let me lay the foundation so we are operating from facts and not from feelings, because feelings will get you destroyed in financial markets. Here is what is actually happening in the United States right now, and I want you to pay close attention to each of these data points, because together they form a picture that you cannot afford to misread. In 2025, the Trump administration began allocating billions of American tax dollars directly into individual publicly traded companies. We are not talking about subsidies in the traditional sense. We are talking about the United States government taking equity positions minus actual investment stakes in companies like Intel, MP Materials, and Lithium Americas, just to name a few that have been publicly disclosed. And what happened immediately after those government dollars went in? Those stocks soared. Because when the single largest economic entity in the history of the world throws its weight behind a stock, the market responds. That is not a coincidence. That is cause and effect, and you need to understand the mechanism. Now, here is where it accelerates into something much larger and much more consequential. President Trump has stated publicly that he wants a United States sovereign wealth fund established in 2026. Understand what that means. A sovereign wealth fund is essentially a government-managed investment account, funded by taxpayer dollars, operating in financial markets on behalf of the nation. Countries like Norway, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have operated sovereign wealth funds for decades. The United States has never had one during peacetime. This would be a fundamental structural change to how the American government interacts with capital markets. Layer on top of that the fact that on May 15, 2026, the Federal Reserve will have a new chairman. Kevin Warsh, appointed by President Trump, is stepping into that role. President Trump has been explicit about what he wants from the Fed: lower interest rates. And lower interest rates in this context are not just about making mortgages cheaper. Lower interest rates mean more money in the system. More money in the system means more capital available to fund government investment vehicles. And more government capital flowing into markets means a fundamental shift in who is moving markets and why. And if that were not enough, there is currently a bill moving through Congress, not yet passed, not yet law, but actively being debated, that would codify into federal law the government's ability to take equity stakes in private companies. That means making it a permanent, legal, standard operating procedure for the United States government to be an active investor in the stock market. We are not talking about a one-time emergency measure. We are talking about institutionalizing government participation in capital markets. That is an enormous shift, and most Americans are completely unaware it is even being discussed. So when you add all of this together, the direct investments already made in 2025, the sovereign wealth fund plan for 2026, the new Fed chair with an interest rate cutting mandate, and the potential congressional legislation, you are looking at a trajectory that points clearly in one direction. The United States government is moving with increasing speed and increasing scale toward becoming a direct participant in its own stock market. And the question you need to be asking yourself is not whether this is good or bad politically. That debate is for people who cannot afford to make money. The question you need to be asking is, what does history tell us happens next? Because history has an answer and it is not ambiguous. Let me take you to Singapore, because Singapore is the case study that the optimists in this conversation will point to, and they are not wrong to point to it as long as they understand precisely why it worked. Because the reason it worked is everything. It is the entire ball game. Singapore's government began investing in its own economy through state-linked entities, most notably Temasek Holdings and the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation. And the results, when you look at the raw numbers, are genuinely extraordinary. In 1980, Singapore's GDP per capita, meaning the average economic output generated per person in that country, was approximately $5,510. By 2024, that number had grown to approximately $67,760. Run that math. That is roughly a 12-fold increase in the economic productivity of the average Singaporean over the course of approximately 4 decades. 12 times, not 12%, minus 12 times. And it was not just GDP, wages followed. Nominal wages in Singapore grew by approximately 14 times over that same period. Now, when you adjust for inflation, the real wage growth comes down to approximately 3 times. But here is why that still matters enormously. 3 times real wage growth over 4 decades is exceptional by any global standard. Most developed economies would celebrate half of that. And alongside all of this, the Singaporean stock market grew by approximately 3 times as well, meaning investors who participated in that market during this period captured real, meaningful wealth creation. So why did it work? Why did Singapore's government investment strategy produce GDP growth, wage growth, and market growth simultaneously when, as we are about to discuss, Japan's strategy produced the opposite? The answer is in the intention and the methodology. Singapore's government did not invest in markets to prop up asset prices. They did not buy broad indexes to keep stock prices artificially elevated. They invested specifically and strategically in companies and industries that they believed could build real productive capacity in the Singaporean economy. They were building something. They were investing with the explicit goal of creating industries, creating employment, creating export capacity, and creating the infrastructure of a modern competitive economy. The investments were a means to an economic end, not an end in themselves. That distinction building versus propping is the single most important concept in this entire conversation. Write it down. Building versus propping, because that distinction is what separates Singapore's 35-year success story from Japan's 35-year nightmare, and it is the same lens through which you need to evaluate what the United States is doing right now. Now, let me take you to Japan, and I want you to brace yourself because the numbers are brutal, and they should be, because what happened to Japan economically over the last 3+ decades is one of the most severe and sustained economic failures in modern history for a developed nation, and it is almost entirely self-inflicted. Japan's government, through mechanisms including the Bank of Japan and the Government Pension Investment Fund, began pumping government money directly into their domestic stock market. But unlike Singapore, Japan was not investing to build new industries or create new productive capacity. Japan was investing to prop up asset prices. They were buying broad market indexes, effectively just pushing money into the market to keep valuations elevated. to prevent the natural correction that market forces were demanding after the asset bubble of the late 1980s. They were playing defense. They were trying to stop prices from falling, and they failed catastrophically, but slowly, which is somehow even worse. Here are the numbers, and I want you to sit with each one of these. Japan's GDP per capita in 1995, the year we start this comparison, was approximately $44,000. By 2024, that number had fallen to approximately $37,000. That is a 16% decline in GDP per capita over the course of approximately 30 years. The average Japanese person is generating less economic value today than they were in 1995. That is not stagnation. That is regression. And it happened in one of the most technologically sophisticated, highly educated, industrially capable nations on the planet. Japan did not fail because its people were lazy or incompetent. Japan failed because its government made a strategic error and then compounded that error for 3 decades rather than correcting it, and the wages confirm the same story. Between 1995 and 2025, real wages in Japan fell by approximately 11%. 11%? Over 30 years, Japan is one of the only countries in the entire developed world, perhaps the only major developed economy, where real wages are lower today than they were in the mid-1990s. Think about what that means for the average Japanese worker. You worked for 30 years. You improved your skills, technology improved, the global economy grew, and at the end of 30 years of work, your paycheck buys less than it did when you started. That is the mathematical definition of a lost generation. And then there is the stock market, which is the number that should hit you like a freight train if you are an investor. The Japanese stock market, the Nikkei 225, peaked in December of 1989. It hit record highs that it would not see again for 35 years. Not in 1990, not in 2000, when every other major market was booming during the dot-com era. Not in 2010, not in 2020. The Japanese stock market did not break those 19,989 record highs until the year 2024, 35 years. If you were a Japanese investor who put money into the broad market in 1999 and held it minus, did everything the conventional wisdom tells you to do, held through the volatility, trusted the long term, you waited 35 years just to get back to even, that is not a bear market. That is a generational catastrophe. And the mechanism that caused this was government money flowing into markets, not to create value, but to prevent the market from doing its job. When you prop up prices artificially, you do not eliminate the underlying economic problems. You delay the reckoning while the problems compound. You create zombie companies that should fail but don't because government money keeps them alive. You misallocate capital on a massive scale because prices are no longer sending accurate signals about where productive investment should flow. And you trap an entire economy in a slow motion decline that is almost impossible to escape because every attempted reform runs into the political resistance of people who benefited from the artificial support. Japan fell into that trap in 1989 and spent 35 years trying to claw its way out of it. Now, here is where I need you to think very carefully, because this is the part of the analysis where intellectual honesty demands that we acknowledge the uncomfortable complexity of the situation. Because when you look at what the United States government is doing right now, you do not see a clean Singapore or a clean Japan. What you see is a hybrid. And in financial markets, ambiguity and mixed signals are often more dangerous than a clear negative outcome because they prevent you from positioning correctly. On one hand, some of what the Trump administration is doing looks distinctly Singaporean in its intent. The investments in Intel are about rebuilding domestic semiconductor manufacturing, an industry the United States essentially outsourced to Asia over the past 3 decades and is now desperately trying to reclaim. The investment in MP Materials is about rebuilding domestic rare earth processing capacity, which is a genuine strategic vulnerability for the American economy given how dependent it has become on Chinese supply chains. The investment in Lithium Americas is about securing domestic lithium supply for the battery and electric vehicle industries that are going to define the next generation of the global economy. These are investments in productive capacity. These are investments designed to build something real. That is the Singapore playbook. But on the other hand, there are signals that point in a much more troubling direction. There were serious discussions about the United States government potentially bailing out Spirit Airlines, a company that, by any honest financial analysis, had failed at the fundamental task of running a viable airline business. Propping up a failing company with government money is not the Singapore playbook. That is the Japan playbook in its purest form. And the sovereign wealth fund concept, as currently being discussed, is broad enough and vague enough in its mandate that it could very easily drift from strategic investment into market support from building to propping, especially when political pressure mounts to prevent market declines in an election cycle. The American Enterprise Institute, and I want you to pay attention to this because the AEI is not a fringe organization. It is one of the most respected economic policy institutions in the country, published an analysis explicitly warning about what they called the Japanification of the United States economy. They are not the only ones raising this concern. A growing number of serious economists and market professionals are looking at the combination of government market intervention, the potential for accelerated money printing under a more politically aligned Federal Reserve, and the structural parallels to Japan's post-bubble strategy, and they are deeply concerned about what they see. And that concern intensifies when you factor in Kevin Warsh at the Federal Reserve. Warsh cuts rates aggressively in an environment where the government is simultaneously expanding its investment activities. You create conditions where more and more money flows into markets for reasons that have nothing to do with underlying corporate earnings or economic productivity. Asset prices get elevated beyond what fundamentals justify. And when asset prices are elevated beyond fundamentals, the only two ways that story ends are a painful correction or a prolonged period of stagnation, which is to say, the story ends either fast and violently like a market crash, or slow and quietly like Japan, where you wake up 35 years later and realize you have been treading water your entire investment to life. So let us talk about what you actually do about this, because analysis without action is just expensive entertainment, and I did not build my track record by sitting on the sidelines paralyzed by uncertainty. The way I have always operated, and the way you should operate, is to identify the scenarios, assign probabilities in your own mind based on your own reading of the evidence, and then position accordingly. So let me give you the 4 scenarios and the mathematical logic behind each positioning strategy. Scenario 1, you believe the United States is following the Japanese path. You believe the government intervention is primarily about propping up markets rather than building productive capacity, that the sovereign wealth fund will drift towards supporting asset prices rather than funding genuine industrial development, and that the long-term consequence will be economic stagnation similar to what Japan experienced. If that is your view, then the investment thesis points clearly toward value, specifically toward dividend-paying companies. Here is the mathematical logic. In a stagnant or slowly declining economic environment, capital appreciation becomes unreliable. The market may trade sideways or decline for extended periods, but a company that generates strong, consistent profits and distributes a meaningful percentage of those profits as dividends continues to pay you regardless of what the market index does on any given day. You are getting paid in cash while you wait. Funds like SEHD, the Schwab U.S. Dividend Equity ETF, are specifically constructed to give you exposure to companies that not only pay dividends, but have demonstrated the discipline to grow those dividends consistently over time, typically requiring at least 10 consecutive years of dividend payments as a qualification threshold. In a Japan-style environment, those cash flows become enormously valuable relative to pure growth stocks that are entirely dependent on capital appreciation. Scenario 2. You believe the United States is following the Singapore path. You believe the government's stated intention to rebuild domestic industries is genuine, consistent, and will be executed with strategic discipline, rather than political opportunism. In that case, the investment thesis points toward the sectors that the government is actively building, and based on publicly stated government intentions, the defense sector is at the top of that list. The geopolitical environment of 2026 is fundamentally more dangerous and more multipolar than at any point since the Cold War. Government investment in defense capacity is not a speculative rumor. It is a logical extension of the current strategic posture of the United States. ETFs like ITA, iShares, U.S. Aerospace and Defense ETF give you diversified exposure to the companies that produce the systems, platforms, and material that a government building out strategic industrial capacity will be purchasing at scale. If government money flows into defense, the defense sector benefits directly and measurably. Scenario 3. You are uncertain about the United States direction and you want geographic diversification as a hedge. This is a legitimate and sophisticated approach. The United States represents approximately 60% of global market capitalization, which means if you only hold U.S. assets, you have made a massive implicit bet on one country's policy decisions, one country's currency, and one country's political stability. International diversification through funds like VXS or VEA, which give you exposure to developed market economies outside the United States, or VUIU, which gives you exposure to emerging market economies with higher growth potential alongside higher volatility, allows you to participate in global economic growth while reducing your concentration risk in a single policy environment. If the United States stumbles the way Japan stumbled, having 30 or 40% of your portfolio in non-U.S. assets could mean the difference between a difficult decade and a financially devastating one. Scenario 4. You are a long-term believer in American economic dominance, and you think the concerns about Japanification are overstated. If that is your honest assessment of the evidence, then your thesis is straightforward. The S&P 500, accessed through something like SPY, the SPDR S&P 500 ETF Trust, has compounded at roughly 10% annually over the long term, has survived the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the dot-com crash, the 2008 financial crisis, and every other catastrophe that was supposed to end American economic primacy. If you believe in the fundamental resilience and adaptability of the American economy, broad market exposure is your vehicle. The mathematical case for that position over any 30-year period in history has been extraordinarily strong. The risk is that the next 30 years are the exception, which is why scenarios 1 through 3 exist as alternatives and as hedges. The critical point across all 4 scenarios is this: you must have a position. You must have a thesis. Sitting in cash and hoping the situation clarifies is itself a bet. It is a bet that inflation will not erode your purchasing power while you wait. And in an environment of potential aggressive money printing from a politically influenced Federal Reserve, that is one of the most dangerous bets you can make. Inflation does not wait for you to get comfortable. Inflation operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, quietly and relentlessly reducing the real value of every dollar you are holding while you deliberate. Let me leave you with the only thing that actually matters at the end of this conversation, which is what you are going to do differently starting today, not next week, not when the Sovereign Wealth Fund is officially announced, not when Kevin Warsh gives his first press conference today. Because here is the brutal mathematical truth about financial markets and about wealth building. The people who wait for certainty before acting never act because certainty never comes. Markets do not ring a bell at the bottom. Governments do not announce in advance which policy path they are going to follow. History does not send you a warning letter before it repeats itself. You have to make decisions with imperfect information, under uncertainty, in real time. And then you have to be disciplined enough to adjust when new information warrants it. That is investing. Everything else is gambling or hoping. Japan's investors in 1989 did not know they were at the beginning of a 35-year stagnation. They thought they were at a temporary peak before the next leg up. Singapore's investors in 1980 did not know they were at the beginning of a 12-fold expansion in economic productivity. They just kept showing up and staying invested in companies that were building real things. The difference between the two outcomes was not luck, it was strategy. It was understanding what kind of intervention the government was making and what the historical precedent for that intervention looked like. You now have that understanding. You have the data, you have the framework, you have four concrete positioning options and the mathematical logic behind each one. The only question left is whether you are going to do something with it or whether you are going to click away from this video and go back to whatever you were doing before. Most people will click away. Most people will remain financially illiterate because it is comfortable and because action requires accountability. Do not be most people.